Can these arguments prove Muhammad was a prophet? Hello, everyone. Over the past week, I've received a number of thoughtful comments from both Muslims and non-Muslims. Rather than replying individually, I want to respond to the underlying arguments. Before I begin, I want to make one thing clear. This video is not about mocking Islam or insulting Muhammad. It's also not primarily about whether God exists. Even if someone convinced me that God exists tomorrow, that still wouldn't tell me whether Islam is true. It wouldn't tell me whether the Quran is divine or whether Muhammad was a prophet. Those are separate concerns. Today, I want to evaluate one Muslim comment in particular because I think it raises the strongest case I've seen recently. The commenter argued that Muhammad could not have invented the Quran because the Quran often refers to Muhammad in the third person. The Quran criticizes Muhammad in several places. Moses and Jesus are mentioned much more frequently than Muhammad. An unlettered Arab from 7th century Mecca could not have known so much about biblical prophets, and therefore the best explanation is divine revelation. I don't think these are silly arguments. In fact, I think they're worth taking seriously. But after thinking about them carefully, I remain unconvinced. Let me explain why. The first point is that the Quran speaks about Muhammad in the third person. That's true, but I'm not sure why that should surprise us. Many ancient works refer to their central figures in the third person. Kings did this. Historians did this. Religious texts did this. It's a perfectly ordinary literary device. So I would simply ask, why does third-person narration point to the creator of the universe? I'm not saying it proves human authorship. I'm saying it doesn't distinguish divine revelation from ordinary literary composition. Now let's move on to what I think is the strongest argument. The Quran occasionally criticizes Muhammad. This is genuinely more interesting. If Muhammad invented the Quran, why would he include verses that appear to rebuke himself? At first glance, that seems impressive. But then I ask myself another question. Is divine revelation the only plausible explanation? I don't think so. One possibility is that Muhammad sincerely believed he was receiving revelation. Under that hypothesis, a revelation correcting him would make perfect sense because he experienced these messages as coming from outside himself. Another possibility is that self-criticism actually increases credibility. Human authors often include weaknesses, failures, or criticism because it makes them appear more authentic. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying there are multiple plausible human explanations. So once again, I don't see why this observation uniquely points to divine revelation. Now here's something else I find interesting. Some verses criticize Muhammad, other verses defend him. Other verses grant him unique privileges. Whether you see those privileges as justified or not, the point is simply this. The Quran contains both criticism and affirmation. So the mere existence of criticism isn't enough by itself to establish divine authorship. The next argument is that Moses and Jesus are mentioned far more than Muhammad. Again, that's true, but I don't understand why that should surprise us. If Muhammad sincerely believed he was restoring the religion of Abraham, or if he wanted to present himself within the existing Abrahamic tradition, then Moses and Jesus would naturally occupy enormous space in the narrative. Whether Muhammad was sincere or not, I would expect the Quran to discuss previous prophets extensively. So once again, I find myself asking, why does this require a supernatural explanation? The next point is that Muhammad knew biblical stories despite living in 7th century Arabia. I actually think this argument underestimates the world Muhammad lived in. Arabia wasn't isolated from the rest of the Near East. There were Jewish tribes. There were Christians. There were traders. There were travelers. There were oral traditions. There were stories circulating long before Islam. Muhammad himself traveled as a merchant. Whether he learned specific traditions from conversations, oral storytelling, neighboring communities, or some combination of these, historians can't reconstruct with certainty. But I don't think knowledge of biblical traditions is something that can only be explained by revelation. Again, there are plausible human explanations. Now I want to pause for a moment because I think this gets to the heart of the discussion. Notice what I'm not saying. I'm not saying I know exactly what happened. I'm not claiming I can diagnose Muhammad's psychology 14 centuries later. I don't know. What I'm saying is something much more modest. When someone claims that the creator of the universe communicated with one particular human being and intended his message for all humanity, that is an extraordinary claim. And extraordinary claims require evidence that clearly distinguishes them from ordinary human explanations. That's really my standard. It's not that nothing could convince me. Some people say skeptics can never be convinced. That's not true. If there were strong historical evidence for unmistakable public miracles, events that clearly exceeded ordinary human explanation, that would absolutely make me stop and reconsider. I'm not asking for certainty. I'm asking for evidence that uniquely points toward divine revelation, and that's why I remain unconvinced by these arguments. Each observation may be true. The Quran does speak in third person. Muhammad is criticized in some places. Moses is mentioned more often. The Quran contains biblical narratives. I grant all of those facts. But each one also has plausible human explanations, and when every piece of evidence can be explained naturally, the cumulative case remains weak. One final point. Some Muslims argue that the Quran itself is the miracle because of its literary uniqueness. Even if I granted that the Quran is one of the greatest works of Arabic literature, and many people certainly believe that, I still don't think uniqueness alone establishes divine authorship. History is full of unique human achievements. Shakespeare was unique. Mozart was unique. Newton was unique. Einstein was unique. Human beings occasionally produce works that transform civilization. Uniqueness by itself doesn't tell us whether something came from God. The question isn't whether the Quran is remarkable. I think it is remarkable. The question is whether its remarkable qualities justify concluding that the creator of the universe authored it. For me, the answer is still no, and that's really where I stand today. I'm not asking Muslims to abandon their faith because of one argument. I'm simply asking whether these particular arguments actually establish what they claim to establish. I appreciate everyone who leaves thoughtful comments, especially those who disagree respectfully. I think conversations like these are far more productive than trading insults. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.